welcome to the fourth in my series of videos, counting down every Genesis song, roughly in order of quality, with some subjectivity, but an attempt to have some objective argumentation as well. Now, this series starts with number 179, so if you haven't heard that one, I'd recommend that you begin there. I do have a playlist that I'll try to link to now-ish. I'm Hans Berger from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We're a contemporary art rock band that draws a fair amount of influence from Genesis, along with a lot of other sources. You might have a good time checking us out on, Bandcamp or whatever your preferred streaming platform is. That said, here we go. Now, this has somewhat of a notorious reputation as one of the clunkers, one of the very few clunkers from what's otherwise a quite solid period. And I'm not really here to disagree. Now, it's not awful. The guitars and the backing vocals have a nice tone to them. The lyric is, heartfelt. The musical box midsection is pleasant. But the issue ultimately is that, the song has maybe 2 minutes of ideas stretched out over about a 6-minute period. And those 2 minutes worth of ideas that are there kind of tend to limp along at a slower pace than maybe would really suit the material. With a lot of these songs, I'll say sometimes that they are kind of better understood in the context of the album. The interesting thing about this song is it maybe is actually worse in context because it does tend to derail the momentum of what's been a really effective album up to that point. So there's quite a lot to unpack in this Calling All Stations B-side. Maybe more to unpack than you might initially think. So the lyric here is narrated by a man who is confessing that he's an imposter, and he's never not going to be an imposter. He's never not going to be kind of an artificial version of what he's trying to present himself as, no matter how hard he tries to. So to begin with, it's interesting that the main instrument at the start of the song is a synthesized saxophone, which almost sounds like a real saxophone, but isn't quite. So there's actually an interesting kind of parallel there between lyrical theme and instrumentation. Now, that may be coincidental, but I think it's a resonant effect, even if it is a coincidence. It's also an oddly poignant thing to hear Ray Wilson singing, given his experience ultimately with the band. And I say that as somebody with a lot of respect and affection for his work and his personality. Again, that's probably just a coincidence, but again, I do think it is, with hindsight, a really interesting coincidence that kind of elevates the power of the song pretty far beyond what it might otherwise be. The whole arrangement does effectively convey a sort of jazzy late-night mood, and that big kind of key section in the middle really does convey tension and melancholy in a really, really kind of moving, effective way. It's actually one of, I would say, the more effective instrumental sections from the whole Calling All Stations session. So the band members have often said that they avoided writing personal songs or songs about more grounded sentiment early on, right? Partly out of a lack of experience, partly out of emotional guardedness. This is probably an excellent example of why, right? This is a song about love, which really has no meaningful relationship to the actual experience of human love. But it's so awkwardly pastoral and romantic. And the chorus and the post-chorus actually do achieve enough of a sense of grandeur through the writing and through the backing vocal and the arrangement that it actually does, I think, come back around to being quite charming, particularly somewhere around the line, "Animal friends help me decide." Also, I would say that unlike a lot of the songs from this album, the strings actually do genuinely enhance the dynamics here. Instrumentally, this is one of the best songs from the album. The main riff has this nice kind of slinky quality that is in fact appropriately serpentine. The melody is eerie and portentous. The strings and backing vocals are minimally present. Now, the lyric here is a version of the Adam and Eve story that is undeniably pretty silly and that used to really annoy me for being too overtly Christian back in the day. But I really think now that the strength of the music, again, particularly that kind of slinky main riff and the really sort of dark, evocative melody, that those things turn that lyric into basically the good kind of silly. And I do mean that in a complimentary way. So most of the great English rock bands had to do kind of like a quasi music hall thing at some point, right? And this song has always seemed to me to draw its inspiration from that, particularly in the sort of jauntiness of that main riff. Now, it does have some reputation as a flat out bad song, and I actually don't think that's fair at all. The lyric is totally unique and full of well observed detail. And there's an intriguing contrast, I think, between, again, like I mentioned, that sort of music hall jauntiness and the outright nastiness of a lot of what they're talking about in that lyric. There's also kind of an unsettled, ambiguous quality to the main chord sequence. And there is a very, very subtle but noticeable sense of build throughout the song. It's one of the, I would say, maybe the subtlest build-ups in their whole catalog. Now, most of what's come earlier, I think, on this ranking is either, songs that are generic or a little bit half-baked, right? Either very bland songs or songs which are clearly aiming for something that they're not achieving. This is maybe even the first thing on the list that, everything about it is developed enough. It is fully executing a unique idea. And I actually really appreciate it for that. So of all the songs on Calling All Stations, this is the one that most people will usually point to as sounding the most completely like Genesis. And I think that's very accurate, right? You've got the kind of the big enveloping synth and fairly tom-heavy drum line. Rutherford is doing a very classic, the sort of muted chunks that he does. The lyric maybe teeters on the brink between meaningful and cheesy, but I would say that it probably lands on the right side of that. There are a couple details that always really got me with this song, and I think this is one of those songs where little things can really elevate the whole, right? The two details that I always noticed in particular are the quiet section after the first chorus, which just appears that one time, doesn't come back, and the bass fills during the verse. In a lot of ways, this is an album where the bass is kind of underperforming, which is really unfortunate given Rutherford's history with that instrument. But the bass fills in the verses actually do a lot to add a little bit of depth and interest to the arrangement that is maybe lacking some other places on the album. Both of those are the kind of detail in writing and arrangement that I've heard a lot of people complain about the absence of in this larger project. And if this isn't the catchiest song, I think that's more forgivable in a more explicitly artsy context like this. So, I think if the whole album were in line with this work, it'd probably be better regarded today. So this B-side is modest, but I think it is convincing. It's the closest they would ever get to soul music in terms of the drum pattern, the way the arrangement is laid out, the songwriting. The use of backing vocals in particular has always kind of struck me as an attempt to kind of replicate the way that the backing vocals in soul music would be arranged, like soul or Motown or something like that. Doesn't necessarily replicate that effect, but you can hear what they were going for. The starkness of the production from the Invisible Touch era, I don't think really helps in terms of achieving that kind of soul music Motown effect. But it actually works better in that attempt than you would maybe give it credit for. And, I think this is kind of the classic B-side, right? It's an experiment that didn't quite come off, but it's a modest, enjoyable song in spite of that. This is very similar in its effect to I'd Rather Be You, actually, in that the arrangement here has always felt to me like a pastiche of like 80s R&B, but it's coming just a couple years after doing something like that was a good idea. And some of the Banks synth swell feels a little at odds here with what the rhythm section is doing. The stylistically, the aspects of the song are the keys, and then the other parts are fighting against each other a little bit as far as what they're trying to achieve for an effect. But the melody and the vocal and the lyric and the performance by Phil, they really do generate real yearning. I think that the combination there, it's one of those songs where the pieces take off a lot better than you would think. It's emotionally effective and memorable, way beyond what you would expect from a description of it. It has kind of an alchemical effect in that regard. That being said, the middle eight is basically unlistenable. So this is a B-side from We Can't Dance that is generally regarded to be better than a lot of the songs on the album, and maybe something that would have been, it might have made the album overall stronger if this had been swapped in. I would probably agree with that. I would also say that this song has kind of a nice grandeur and sweep, but at the same time, it doesn't quite shake the sluggishness and the thinness in terms of the sound and the performance that dogs a lot of the weaker parts of this album. You can imagine them doing pretty much this exact song at the beginning of the 80s instead of the beginning of the 90s, and making it sound bigger and harder and playing it more energetically and making it sound fuller. So this lyric is, which if you haven't heard it, is about the psychological complexities of men's relationships to pinup magazines. This lyric is, I would say, probably maybe the smartest and most effective and best developed lyric on Invisible Touch. Maybe tied with one or two other things, but maybe the best in that regard. And I really love, as a production trick, that moment where they end the song by, it's almost like they just pull a plug out of a wall or something, right? It just kind of stops. I find that amusing, and it's particularly nice given how over-reliant they became on fade-outs from Invisible Touch through the end of their career. But the melody is more annoying than catchy, or it's catchy in an annoying way, which they very rarely were. And there's just a lot of sounds in the arrangement that are unpleasant, for lack of a better word. The interesting thing, though, is that on the one hand, this song it's a mismatch of a wonderful lyric with a fairly annoying melody and arrangement. But then at the same time, I don't know if I can imagine that lyric living atop any other instrumental bed, right? So it's kind of a paradox in that regard. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for listening to my thoughts. I will see everybody in a couple weeks.